Russia's grand offensive, a desperate and all-encompassing gamble meant to change the entire course of this war, has ended in catastrophic failure. What was supposed to be a decisive push has become a monument to a strategic and tactical collapse, a profound blunder that has left the Russian military in a state of terminal decline. This was a campaign of breathtaking ambition. The Russian command's strategic goals were clear and expansive. They aimed to finally and completely seize the entire Donbas region. They planned to create a deep buffer zone in the border regions of Kharkiv and Sumy. They sought to push toward major cities like Zaporizhia. This wasn't a feint or a local assault. It was a maximum effort, a last-ditch attempt to achieve a decisive operational breakthrough that would change the course of the war. For 4 months, from May to August, the world held its breath, watching to see if Russia's vast numerical advantage could finally break the Ukrainian defense. But the results are in, and they are damning. The Russian army failed to achieve a single one of its strategic objectives. Let's look at the numbers. Over 4 months of continuous fighting, Russia captured a mere 500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That is a truly microscopic gain for such a monumental effort. No major city was captured. The attempts to encircle the crucial Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration failed completely. The city of Konstantinovka, which was under intense pressure, remains firmly in Ukrainian hands. The front did not collapse, it bent, but it did not break. The Russian command's grand plan was a total and absolute failure. The reasons for this failure are rooted in a classic, fatal strategic error. The Russian command tried to do everything at once. Instead of concentrating their forces for a decisive blow on a single vulnerable point, they dispersed them across the entire front. They launched simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts, from Sumy to the Donbas and from Zaporizhia to Kupiansk. This was a direct result of a flawed strategic doctrine that tried to create an operational crisis for the Ukrainian military. The hope was that by stretching Ukraine's limited reserves across an immense front, the Russian army would eventually find a weak point and achieve a breakthrough. But this strategy was a spectacular failure. The Ukrainian command, using its advantage of internal lines, was able to move its reserves to respond to each crisis, preventing a single one from turning into a catastrophe. The tactical reality of this campaign was even more brutal. The Russian command, in a desperate attempt to conserve its dwindling supply of modern armor, relied almost exclusively on infantry assaults. These assaults, which were slow and lacked the firepower of a combined arms operation, were easily contained and defeated by Ukrainian forces. The Russian command's obsession with a wide front and an all-at-once offensive was a direct result of a fundamental lack of understanding of the realities of modern warfare. They were fighting a war of numbers in a world where technology and intelligence are the decisive factors. The summer of 2025 was not a victory for the Russian military. It was a tragic, bloody demonstration of its profound strategic and tactical incompetence. It was a grand gamble that failed completely. And the only thing it proved is that the Russian army, in its current form, is incapable of winning this war. The grand strategic failure of Russia's summer offensive is staggering, but the true tragedy lies in the price that was paid for it. This was not a bloodless campaign. It was a devastating, record-breaking exercise in human and material loss that yielded nothing but a tactical dead end. The Russian army was not just defeated, it was bled dry. Its vast reserves of men and equipment exhausted in a brutal, months-long offensive that accomplished nothing. Let's start with the human cost, a number so horrific it's hard to comprehend. Russia's official reports are, as always, wildly unreliable, but the intelligence from the ground is clear. Over 4 months, the Russian military suffered an unprecedented number of casualties, a record even for a military that has shown a complete disregard for human life. The front lines became a meat grinder, where assault after assault was broken by a combination of Ukrainian drones, artillery, and a fierce, determined defense. These weren't just losses. These were entire battalions and brigades that were ground into dust for a few hundred meters of scorched earth. This is the ultimate sign of a losing war, when you are paying a catastrophic, unsustainable price for absolutely no strategic gain. But the human cost is only half of the story. The Russian military's vast, decades-old stockpile of Soviet-era equipment, once thought to be inexhaustible, has been burned through. The Russian command, in a desperate attempt to conserve its modern armor, had relied almost exclusively on infantry assaults. But even those were not sustainable. The lack of combined arms support, the outdated equipment, and the relentless precision of Ukrainian drones and artillery meant that the infantry assaults were often wiped out before they could even reach their objectives. Now, as the offensive has stalled, the Russian military is being forced to pull relics from long-term storage, tanks and armored vehicles from the 1950s and 60s that are more a symbol of desperation than of military might. This isn't a military that is winning. It's a military that is scraping the bottom of the barrel, a force that has been completely hollowed out by its own reckless campaign. The vicious cycle of this failure is what makes it so devastating. The massive number of casualties has forced Russia to lower its standards for recruitment, bringing in poorly trained and unmotivated soldiers to replace its hardened veterans. The destruction of its modern equipment has forced them to rely on outdated, poorly protected vehicles. These older tanks and APCs are far more vulnerable to Ukrainian FPV drones and Western anti-tank missiles, leading to even higher casualty rates. This is a spiral of decline that is accelerating with every passing day. The Russian military is not just losing, it is becoming a hollowed-out force, unable to sustain its numbers or its equipment. The vicious cycle of this failure is what makes it so devastating. The massive number of casualties has forced Russia to lower its standards for recruitment, bringing in poorly trained and unmotivated soldiers to replace its hardened veterans. The destruction of its modern equipment has forced them to rely on outdated, poorly protected vehicles. These older tanks and APCs are far more vulnerable to Ukrainian FPV drones and Western anti-tank missiles, leading to even higher casualty rates. This is a spiral of decline that is accelerating with every passing day. The Russian military is not just losing, it is becoming a hollowed-out force, unable to sustain its numbers or its equipment. The entire campaign has led to a tactical dead end. The Russian military, after 4 months of its grand offensive, is no closer to achieving its goals. It is stuck in a war of attrition that it cannot win, paying a high price for a few square kilometers of land that have no strategic value. The Russian army has been destroyed not just by Ukrainian forces, but by its own flawed strategic doctrine, a doctrine that tried to win a war of technology with a war of numbers. The summer of 2025 was not a victory for the Russian military. It was a tragic, bloody demonstration of its profound strategic and tactical incompetence. It was a grand gamble that failed completely. And the only thing it proved is that the Russian army, in its current form, is incapable of winning this war.
We've chronicled the strategic and tactical failures of the Russian offensive, but the most grotesque and telling sign of a military in decline is not found in the field. It is found in the command centers, where a desperate leadership is trying to invent a victory it could not win. The Russian army's biggest war is not with Ukraine, it is with reality. This is the story of how the Russian General Staff is fighting a war in a virtual world, a war of propaganda and lies that is being paid for in the blood of its own soldiers. The disconnect between the official Russian narrative and the reality on the ground is now so profound it is almost comical. The Russian command, in a desperate attempt to show progress, has resorted to a campaign of outright lies. The most damning evidence of this comes from a map presented by the Chief of the General Staff himself, Valery Gerasimov, which showed a wildly optimistic version of the front. This map, which was meant to be a serious military briefing, depicted key Ukrainian cities like Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka as being encircled or on the verge of capture. The reality, as confirmed by satellite imagery and boots on the ground, was that Russian forces were nowhere near those positions. This isn't a small mistake, it's a complete fabrication. It shows a command structure that is so detached from the reality of the war that it is now fighting a war that exists only on paper. This deceit is a direct result of the system's perverse incentives. Lower-level commanders, in a desperate attempt to meet their superiors' demands for progress, are submitting false reports of territorial gains. This creates a vicious feedback loop of misinformation, where the top leadership, living in its own information bubble, is given a completely false picture of the war. They are making strategic decisions based on a fantasy, ordering their troops to push forward and secure positions that have already been destroyed or never even captured in the first place. The result is a tactical nightmare. Russian soldiers are being ordered to storm positions that their command believes are already theirs, a suicidal and pointless exercise that is causing a staggering number of casualties. The Russian army is being destroyed not just by Ukrainian forces, but by its own lies. The most cynical and inhumane example of this propaganda war is the tactic of flag planting. Unable to win a battle on the ground, the Russian command is now resorting to a desperate and brutal show of force. Small, isolated groups of soldiers are sent on what are essentially suicide missions to penetrate a town, raise a Russian flag for a drone's camera, and then are either killed or abandoned. This is a tactic that is designed to create a propaganda victory without actually having to capture or hold the territory. The Russian Ministry of Defense can then use the video of the flag to claim a victory, while in reality, the town is still under Ukrainian control, and the soldiers who planted the flag are dead. This isn't a military strategy. It's a cynical, bloody public relations stunt that is a testament to the moral bankruptcy of the Russian command. This is a profound, systemic failure of a military that has lost its moral compass. The flag planting tactic is a metaphor for the entire Russian war effort, a lie built on the blood of its own people. It shows a military that has completely lost its moral compass and is willing to sacrifice its own soldiers' lives for a public relations victory. The Russian command is so detached from the reality of the war that it is unable to distinguish between a real victory and a fake one. This profound disconnect between reality and perception is the single greatest weakness in the Russian military, and it's a weakness that will, in all likelihood, lead to its ultimate downfall. The summer of 2025 was not a victory for the Russian military. It was a tragic, bloody demonstration of its profound strategic and tactical incompetence. It was a grand gamble that failed completely, and the only thing it proved is that the Russian army, in its current form, is incapable of winning this war.
We have chronicled the strategic and tactical failures of the Russian offensive. But the most damning conclusion of all is not that Russia was defeated, it's that it was defeated by its own refusal to learn. This was a war fought not just against Ukrainian forces, but against the ghosts of past military failures. A war where a high command that is fighting with the doctrine of the 20th century was defeated by the realities of the 21st. The summer of 2025 was a brutal, bloody lesson, and the Russian military failed to learn a single thing. The first and most fundamental reason for this catastrophic failure was a profound strategic incompetence. The Russian command, in a classic and repeated error, dispersed its forces across the entire front. They launched simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts, a flawed doctrine that was meant to stretch Ukrainian reserves thin. But it failed spectacularly. The Ukrainian command, using the advantage of internal lines, was able to shift its reserves from quiet sectors to crisis points, stabilizing the front and preventing a collapse. This is a lesson that has been taught in military academies for decades, and yet the Russian high command, in its arrogance, refused to learn it. They were fighting a war that existed only in their imaginations, a war of numbers and wide fronts, while Ukraine was fighting a war of agility and precision. This strategic failure was compounded by a tactical incompetence that can only be described as a complete failure of learning. The Russian command, in a desperate attempt to conserve its dwindling supply of modern armor, relied almost exclusively on infantry assaults. These assaults, which were slow and lacked the firepower of a combined arms operation, were easily contained and defeated by Ukrainian forces. The Russian command's obsession with a wide front and an all-at-once offensive was a direct result of a fundamental lack of understanding of the realities of modern warfare. They were fighting a war of numbers in a world where technology and intelligence are the decisive factors. This is not a new problem for the Russian military.
We have historical documents from World War II where Soviet generals were ordering their subordinates to stop the practice of unprepared and suicidal frontal assaults. And yet, after nearly 80 years, the Russian military is still using the same tactics. The Z-bloggers, who are in contact with the soldiers on the ground, have been sounding the alarm for months. They have been telling their commanders that the old tactics are not working, that the reliance on infantry assaults is causing a catastrophic number of casualties. But the Russian High Command, in its arrogance, has refused to listen. They were more interested in following their own flawed doctrine than in learning from the bloody lessons of the battlefield. This strategic and tactical incompetence was met with a brilliant and decisive response from Ukraine. The Ukrainian military, in a stunning display of innovation and adaptability, used its superiority in drones and precision artillery to counter the Russian offensive. Ukrainian drones created a kill zone that made it impossible for Russian columns to advance. They were used to destroy Russian armor and prevent any tactical success from developing into a strategic one. This is a fundamental change in the nature of warfare. The war is no longer about who has the better army. It is about who has the better intelligence, the more effective drones, and the willingness to adapt. The summer of 2025 was a decisive strategic defeat for Russia, and it was caused not by an enemy with a better army, but by a military that refused to learn from its own mistakes. The failure was a self-inflicted wound, and the lessons of the war have been completely ignored by the Russian High Command. It was a grand gamble that failed completely, and the only thing it proved is that the Russian army, in its current form, is incapable of winning this war.
We have chronicled the tactical fiascos, the strategic blunders, and the sheer human cost of Russia's summer offensive. But the final, most important conclusion of all is not just that Russia was defeated. It's that this defeat has fundamentally and irreversibly changed the nature of the war. The summer of 2025 was the end of the old war, a final bloody chapter that proved Russia cannot and will not win in a large-scale conventional conflict. The Grand Offensive was a strategic gamble that failed completely. It was Russia's last, best chance to win a war of maneuver, to use its numerical superiority in men and tanks to break through the front and achieve a decisive victory. But the war is no longer about that. The summer proved that Russia's old doctrine of using massive armored assaults to break through a front line is now obsolete. It is a suicide mission. The front did not collapse. It bent, but it did not break. And in the process, the Russian military was bled dry, its reserves of men and equipment exhausted in a brutal, months-long offensive that accomplished nothing. The war that Russia has been fighting for nearly 3 years is over. And now, a new one has begun. This new war is a war of attrition, of small, exhausting battles, and of technology. It is a war that Russia is now being forced to fight on Ukraine's terms. The Russian military, unable to win a conventional battle, is now resorting to a new, brutal and bloody tactic: infiltration. They are sending small, isolated groups of soldiers to try and create a foothold in the Ukrainian rear, a slow and methodical campaign that is designed to exhaust the enemy and create a sense of chaos. But Ukraine is ready for this. The Ukrainian military has adapted and is now using its technological superiority to counter this threat. The failure of the summer offensive was a decisive strategic defeat for Russia. It proved that Russia's old, conventional military is no match for a modern, innovative, and adaptable opponent. The war is no longer about who has the bigger army or the more resources. It is about who has the better intelligence, the more effective drones, and the willingness to adapt. Russia's failure has fundamentally changed the course of the war and has proven that the path to victory for Ukraine is now clearer than ever. The final verdict on this failure is a sobering one. The summer of 2025 was not a victory for the Russian military. It was a public, catastrophic confession of a military that is in terminal decline. It was a war that proved Russia cannot win in a conventional battle and is now being forced to fight a new, more brutal and exhausting kind of conflict. The war has changed forever,
and the path to victory for Ukraine is now clearer than ever.